Next panel discussion will be on opportunities and challenges for defense, innovation, and reform. This really will continue on some of the threads that came up in our first discussion between Chairman Thornberry and Senator Talent, which should be no surprise in principle. Of course, the major topics they discussed were immediate challenges to defense readiness today, and also a point that Chairman Thornberry raised about, as he described it, the eroding technological advantage enjoyed by United States forces going forward. We have an excellent group to discuss this topic today. It'll be moderated by Dr. Thomas Mahnken, who is the chairman and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's also a senior research professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. In the discussion today will be Ben FitzGerald, who is with the Center for National and the Center for a New American Security, if I could get that correct. Rebeccah Heinrichs, who's with the Hudson Institute, and last on the panel is Mr. Rob Weiss, who leads the Skunk Works team at Lockheed Martin. Greatly look forward to your comments. Thank you all for joining us, and ask you to join me in thanking them for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. And I think the panel's topic, our charge, is a very apropos one, not just as was brought up by Chairman Thornberry, Senator Talent this morning. You know, at least since World War II, the United States has sought to maintain a qualitative advantage over prospective competitors and adversaries. And that was the focus of a lot of effort during the Cold War. Over the last quarter century, the U.S. has enjoyed unquestioned dominance, at least from a qualitative standpoint. In the 1990s, as Charles Krauthammer famously dubbed the unipolar moment, and then over the last 15 years, the focus of defense has been quite rightly, counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. But now, we face the reemergence of great power competition and an increasing probability or possibility of great power conflict, whether because of Russia's aggression in Eastern Europe, China's assertiveness in maritime Asia. And so I think it's quite appropriate as we close out the Obama administration, look to the Trump administration, we kind of take stock of where we are and where we need to be. So certainly in recent years, the Obama Defense Department has placed emphasis on the so-called third offset strategy, the Defense Innovation Initiative. And as we approach the end of the Obama administration, I wanted to ask our panel, how they would take stock of those efforts from their standpoint, whether it's running a science and technology program at a think tank, focusing on missile defense and other areas, or from defense industry. Where do we stand with the third offset strategy and whatever it will become in future months and years?
So there's a lot to unpack in there, and I think the sort of my bottom line up front would be, I think that leadership in the Pentagon and also frankly on the Hill have created a window of opportunity for some fairly significant change. We're going to see, I think at noon today, more details of the NDAA for 2017, but we already have seen some fairly significant structural changes. And also under the leadership of Secretary Carter and Deputy Secretary Work, we've seen a real focus on the need to improve our military technical advantage. That's great. It's unclear to me if that's actually going to move forward or what it's going to look like. I would also say that while it's great that we all have a common understanding that we need to improve, how we get there is not clear. The third offset strategy, I think, is important and helps us address one very particular problem, which is our ability to continue to project power, conventional military power. That's one thing. That's separate from, in some ways, all this other innovation conversation. A lot of those actions have been very good. I think the DIUX in its current instantiation is great. We're actually hosting an event with them later this afternoon, not to compete with this. But those have been innovations sort of outside of the bureaucracy, around the bureaucracy. We're going to create a new office. What we haven't seen is a fundamentally different approach to how we generate military technical advantage and how we pair that military, the technology with new concepts of operation. And I think that that's what we need. And I'm happy to unpack that in more detail, but I don't want to monopolize this whole conversation.
Okay, great. Rebeccah, how about you?
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to be here. If I could just go back a little bit to 2014 when then Secretary of Defense Hagel sort of introduced the third offset strategy. He provided some context about what he was talking about, what the threats were, and why we needed this new third offset strategy. And some of the things he talked about were that less sophisticated actors like Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah were beginning to challenge the United States in ways that we haven't seen before. And then, of course, on the higher end, near-peer competitors, China and Russia were advancing in military modernization programs in ways that the United States hadn't seen in decades. And then he listed some specific technologies that they were spending a lot of time and resources and energy in, and they were in areas in which they saw a vulnerability where the United States had, and so they were taking advantage of that vulnerability and exploiting it. And so they were developing new missile technologies, advanced aircraft, submarines, longer range and more accurate missiles. He mentioned missiles multiple times. Undersecretary Frank Kendall has, I think, been one of the most helpful administration officials in laying out specifically where we are getting behind. And I like specificity, and I think in the age of Trump, we're going to have more specificity and less vagueness, which I'm excited about. That will, I think, do a lot to help us move forward so we know what we're talking about here, so we're not just talking about things in vague terms. But Undersecretary Kendall, again, he mentioned in a memo he sent over to Congress that the United States was getting behind in missile technology, that he specifically mentioned China, but then made clear that he wasn't only talking about China, but China and Russia were challenging the United States in space. And that posed a unique problem because everything else we do in the Pentagon depends on what we do in space. And so if space is unprotected or does have vulnerabilities or we're getting behind or others are challenging us in this particular domain, that portends very, very bad things for the United States across the rest of the Pentagon. And so I think that is going to be, if I had my way, I think that we're going to be focusing more on space, what we do in space, in national security space, surveillance in space. I think that, President-elect Trump is a new kind of president-elect, will be a new kind of president. Sort of the things that we sort of have gotten used to, I think, inside the Beltway and inside the Pentagon. We sort of all know what each other means when we say very vague terms and vague phraseology where the new president is going to want to be convinced and persuaded. And so I think everybody's going to have to do their homework when we start talking about what it is that we want the administration to do. And I think that's a very good thing because it's going to have to make sense. It's going to have to be the most cost-effective way to do it. And so I think things like, we just don't put kinetic kill capabilities in space because it might be provocative. I think you're going to have to make your case if that's what you think. I take another perspective and say we can't just have passive space capabilities. We're going to have more active defense capabilities in space. And so I think that's going to be the next phase in our ballistic missile defense capabilities, in addition to directed energy technologies, the MOKV that we're putting on the GMD system to protect the United States homeland. I think we're going to see more investments in that. And so all of this means that we've taken too long to come to this place where it's no longer a matter of should we do it someday. It's that we have to do that. Our adversaries are challenging us in that way. We have to do that. And all of that means, my last point on this is that we sort of, when we began to talk about the think tank world and inside the Pentagon, how we're going to pay for this new offset strategy. A lot of people talk about legacy systems. We're going to pay with legacy systems. But now we've seen that, oh no, we're still fighting some of these wars in which we need these legacy systems. The newer advanced technologies, the F-35 isn't still quite ready, and so we're keeping the A-10 now. which I'm very excited about because I love that airplane. So, and so does John McCain. So it's going to be around longer. We need it. We're still using it. And so now, where are we going to get this money? And that means, of course, we're going to have to increase the top line. I'm optimistic that with the new administration, we will be increasing the top line. And we're not just going to be bill paying with legacy systems for new advanced technologies. We're going to have to do both. And so that means getting rid of the BCA, which I think is the direction that we're headed.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. Rob, where do you think we stand with the third offset strategy and defense innovation initiative and defense innovation more broadly?
Well, thanks, Tom, and it's great to be here this morning representing defense industry and the conversation. You know, I'd like to begin actually by just kind of talking a little bit about where we are in the nation from my point of view. One of the great things in my job, I get to go out and interface with many of our young women and men who are defending the nation, and I would contend that we remain to have the best fighting force across the globe, bar none. We have the best people. They're well trained, and they frankly have the best equipment compared to any other nation in the world. That said, there's some real challenges, many of which we talked about earlier this morning by Chairman Thornberry. We're spread too thin. We have a readiness decline, and we have a acquisition system that needs to be more agile. Specifically regarding the third offset, we are investing in virtually every technology that's highlighted in the third offset. Hypersonics, big data analytics, open system architectures, autonomy, directed energy, on and on. And we're demonstrating a lot of those technologies right now. Not only Lockheed Martin and the Skunk Works, who I work for, but our competitors, our teammates across the defense industry. So I believe we have a qualitative advantage in the technology today. The question is, how do we field it more quickly, I believe. And when we look at the adversaries we face around the globe, a lot of this is presence. You know, we're talking about the Western Pacific, Eastern Europe, and in order to enable that presence, we do need a substantial force structure that has been on a decline for many years now. And I think that's one of the big challenges is transitioning this technology to a larger force structure as we move forward. And that will, in my view, enable us to maintain the qualitative advantage across the globe.
Okay.
Can I just respond to that? I think that what we've seen here is that we have a fundamentally strategic problem. And while I'm very sympathetic about the need for acquisition reform, I believe in the need for that. We've seen some positive steps in the last couple of years. We've had an acquisition system that hasn't been great since arguably the 1970s. And yet we were able to maintain qualitative advantages throughout that. So what's changed? And I think that we've seen that in the latter part of the 20th century, we still had a pretty neat strategic alignment between our strategic needs, which was really until the end of the Cold War, containment, and we had a fairly finite set of technologies we needed to invest in, and we had very clear business models in terms of defining requirements from strategic threats through technologies out of the defense industry, and then we could lock that in with export controls. None of those things pertain today. We have a range of threats, from terrorism to cyber threats to great power competition. We have shown no appetite to pick which ones of those we're going to try to address, where we're going to take risk or not. We want to do everything. We have a much wider range of technologies. We've just heard all of those. And to your point, we still need to maintain legacy systems. We can't walk away from that. So we want all of those things as well. And yet we're still trying to use the same business models. It doesn't add up. And that's where we need to look at not just acquisition reform or the top line. It's what's our approach? How are we going to make those choices? And that's what we have not yet had that conversation.
And that's a topic I want us to address in a minute. But before we get there, actually pick up on something that a couple of you mentioned, which is, we can't do it all. So what are the areas, and Rebecca addressed this a little bit, but what are the areas that are particularly promising in your view, as we think about innovation and we think about maintaining an advantage going forward? And I'll be kind of straightforward about this, and I'll go back down this way.
I'll answer quickly, given that I just started monologuing spontaneously. I'm increasingly skeptical of trying to pick technological winners. I don't think we can do that. Things change too rapidly. We need to maintain a broader portfolio of investments in a range of technologies and then figure out internal methods where we can be more agile in deciding, well, based on the threat environment, we're going to move these things forward or leave these things back. So we need that broader portfolio where we can take things from prototyping and move them forward quickly. So I'm more interested in that type of innovation rather than saying, like lasers. I know they've been 5 years away since 1972, but they're really only 5 years away. I don't know. And I don't know if we'll be facing an enemy that addresses that. The one gap that I see in what we do is the ability to incorporate commercial technology and adapt it for military purposes. That's where I think we have the most opportunity to move forward. It's great to say that there's all this commercial technology out there and that they're moving ahead. We can acquire it, but we have no process for actually adapting that for truly military purposes and to generate unique military advantage from broadly available commercial technology. That's where I'd be focusing.
Okay. And Rebeccah, you mentioned space, you mentioned missile defense. Would you add to that, or?
Sure. Yeah. What I would say is, again, I'm encouraged and optimistic by the new opportunities that this administration means for the Pentagon, because we get to sort of take a fresh look at where these vulnerabilities are. Where is the United States being targeted? Again, I talked about this is the new missile age. I talk about missiles a lot, not because I just randomly selected them of all the different threats, but it's because that is becoming how, all the way from North Korea on the low end to China on the high end, that is how they they're investing in these technologies in order to coerce and deter and dissuade the United States from doing many different things in the region. Several months ago, I had the privilege of authoring a report that had a senior review board, including 2 NORTHCOM commanders, the former director of the Missile Defense Agency, former administrator of NASA, so a whole slew of people who were very familiar with the high-end threats, the missile threats, also the acquisition process and what would need to be done in order to close these gaps. And they all agreed with the findings and recommendations in this study. And what we found was that the United States, it's not a matter of can the United States, are our engineers smart enough to come up with technologies that can close these gaps? Of course they are. Of course they are. It really is, if you go back to what is the problem, what is the hindrance in order to move forward with some of these more advanced technologies, and it's been policy. The United States has been intentionally holding back in particular areas of advanced technologies for fear of becoming provocative or of trailblazing in a particular area or of weaponizing space, some of these buzz phrases that we've heard for many decades that simply don't make sense anymore because this is what the Chinese and the Russians are doing, this is where the Iranians are going, et cetera. And so I think some of these challenges, so they're resources, they're the problems with resources, but I think that's actually a more, that's a shorter hurdle that I think we can clear. I think some of the bigger problems have been a matter of policy, and so I'm excited about the opportunity that we can have in terms of changing those policies. And actually, we talk about America's technological edge or technological advantage. I like to just say American primacy. We're going to get back in the business of American primacy and unapologetically. And so I think that's a very good thing. And I think once you sort of say that and get that out of the way, that's what we're doing. We're moving forward in that way. We're not going to sort of maintain peer status with China and Russia. We're moving forward. We're plowing ahead. And then I really do think the sky's the limit. And then it comes down to where are we going to get some of the money. And the Budget Control Act has always been confusing to me because nobody wants it. The Congress doesn't want it, the President doesn't want it, and yet here we are, we have it. And then the President threatens to veto bills that go above the Budget Control Act restrictions, even though he says he doesn't want it. The conference report that was just, I think, settled, I don't know if these figures are official, but this is what the media is reporting now. It's $3.2 billion above the PB. So Congress is excited about spending more money on the Pentagon, which it should. If we're going to spend money anywhere, it's on American security. So I think that we'll see what happens with President Obama in his last few weeks here and what he decides to do with this bill and if we can pass it and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that it means that we're sort of headed a different direction.
Okay. Rob, how about you?
Well, I think Rebeccah made several good points there about maintaining American primacy. Going back to your point, Ben, about the span of tasks that we're asking our military to do today, I don't see it changing.
No,
I think we're going to have to maintain a capability against near-peer threats, major regional actors, and counterterrorism. And so we've got to be able to address all of them. And I think the priorities and what we invest in as a nation to address those priorities are very important. So clarity in the national military strategy, I think, is something that is going to be key. And then we're going to have to budget accordingly, to Rebeccah's point. And that will enable us to do what we need to do around the globe. You know, I think the other points have been made. We are investing in these technologies. As I mentioned earlier, we are prototyping and proving out these technologies. So we're seeing mature capabilities that now need to transition to programs of record so that we can, in fact, bring about the force we need. You know, I could tell a lot of stories of the skunk works that we have about, but, you know, one that just pops into my head, I think about the F-117 when it was fielded as the first stealth fighter back and it came out in Desert Storm back in the early 90s. And a tremendous capability that demonstrated something the United States had that no adversary had at the time. But it began with a program that many of you may not know called Have Blue. That was the prototype. And it proved that we could actually fly this, you know, hopeless diamond, as it was called. And we proved that out, and then it transitioned to a program of record. And I think that's what's going to be key going forward is as we prove out these technologies, that they actually transition, move forward quickly. So.
Well, and there's a challenge there, right? So the challenge of being in an era of budgetary constraints on the one hand, there's a lot of reluctance to transition to programs of record. On the other hand, there's a different set of challenges coming with opening up the budgetary spigot, right? I mean, because the tendency is, well, if you have a lot of money, well, just keep doing more of the same.
Exactly.
Perhaps less, less urgency for doing things differently. So, yeah, and maybe we'll start with Rob and come back this way. Talk a little bit more about the budgetary dimension of all this. How big a constraint is the budget right now, and what's the best way to move forward sensibly?
Well, I think I might start by answering your question. We talked a little bit about F-35 earlier today, and if we think about just in the air dominance spectrum, for example. So we have a program that the nation has invested considerably in over the last decade or more, the F-35. And it is now, we recognize it's had some challenges along the way, but it is now a very mature, capable system. But the rate that we're buying the airplane is insufficient. And all the services are ready for new equipment. And so we should start by buying the leading edge technologies that are already available to us today. Because that will not only provide us more capability, but it's going to get us out of these older airplanes that are costing a substantial amount of money to maintain and are insufficient against future threats. So I would begin there. And again, speaking in the air dominance arena, the next step is to modernize these airplanes. Over the life cycle of all aircraft, all successful aircraft programs have had robust modernization to continue to add capability over its life cycle. So we need to be doing that with our advanced systems as well. And this is not just airplanes, but everything we've invested in. And the third step is to continue to invest in technology that's 25 or 30 years away. So again, coming back to air dominance, we're investing in those technologies today. Someday we will field another fighter. But right now, we should buy the one that's available to us and get on an aggressive modernization path. So the budget is not there to do that today. And frankly, coming back to the F-35, it becomes the bill payer for everything else we want to do. And that's not the best way to go about an acquisition.
Rebeccah, you pointed out, I think quite rightly, that BCA makes no sense except for the fact that it's the law of the land. So assuming, and I think that it is an assumption, but assuming that changes, I mean, how do we go about spending money, the most effective way, the most responsible way, but also the way that gives us the greatest advantage?
Sure. Every time I talk about wanting to get rid of the BCA and talking about how we need to increase the defense budget, people immediately think that I don't care about waste. I don't care about defense waste. I don't care about acquisition costs that are unnecessary, et cetera. And of course, that's just not true. We can do both. We can fix both. We have been planning and spending money in ways that don't make sense at all. In the Pentagon. I think everybody in the room would agree with that. Some of the things we can do differently is we can buy more of a particular item at once. This sort of, buying a couple of items, procuring a couple of them, and then buying a couple more when we need them, and letting production lines go cold, and then having to restart them and finding the people to build them and the expertise to invest in to build them. That is incredibly expensive. It's incredibly short-sighted. It's not thinking through in the long run how the country can spend money more efficiently. I mean, if this is how families ran their own personal budgets, we would see a lot of bankrupt people. So we need to start thinking about how do we spend, how do we plan, how do we prioritize. We talked about the F-35 a little bit, but I also heard, as we put together the new budget, as the Air Force was considering major big-ticket items, I heard that. And these were just people thinking out loud, but maybe we should kick the new ICBM down the road, the GBSD down the road, because we need to pay for the F-35 now. Why in the world is the F-35 competing with our nuclear triad? That makes no sense. We need to have the nuclear triad. We need to have the next generation Air Force fighter jet. So in no reality does it make sense to punt on what I would argue is quite possibly the backbone of our nuclear triad, something that we absolutely need, and we can't afford to kick it down to the right. So we need to prioritize programs, figure out what the United States is going to prioritize, what we need, what we can no longer afford to punt on. And then we need to start figuring out how many of these items we can buy at once so that we're not having this trickle effect and then just creating a lot of extra cost on that end as well. I'll leave it at that. I've got more ideas, but we can.
Ben.
So I'm not sure about that. Yes, we want efficiency in the programs that we do, but I think we've seen, certainly since the end of the Cold War, this push towards efficiency, sort of a putative efficiency. So we're just going to have a single multi-role combat aircraft. And that's going to be less expensive. I'm not sure that that's turned out to be the case. Not criticizing the good work done by Lockheed to build the F-35, but from a DoD perspective, was that the right approach? And when we talk about the cost associated with that, if you've got an aircraft which has a cost per hour flight of about $40,000, and we're going to potentially be rolling that out against people in $10,000 Hilux trucks, that's not an asymmetric strategy or a cost-imposing strategy on the part of our enemy. That's a self-imposed cost-imposing strategy. I love when people ask me about cost-imposing strategies. It's like, we're really good at running them on ourselves. Other people, I question it. But so I think that I agree, BCA is irresponsible. But I don't think it's purely an issue of top line. We need to think about what is an actual portfolio investment strategy across this range of things. And what are the ways in which we can buy down risk, depending on how you count it. Since the early 1990s, we spent between $45 and $90 billion worth of taxpayer funds on projects that have yielded zero capability. So when you look at future combat system, cost overruns and other things, so I don't think that we're starving for dollars. I just don't think that we've got the right approach. So I think we need to think about how do we have a more diverse force mix so that we don't just get into monocultures where we're putting expensive platforms that assume efficiencies over 50 or 60-year life cycles. We don't know what's going to happen next year. We are continually surprised in the strategic environment, and we need to have a capability portfolio that allows us to respond to that. It's going to be less efficient, and it's going to be a little bit more expensive as we go, but it means that we're going to have less likelihood of massive multi-billion-dollar failures or strategic failures in the future.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes left for this session, and if previous sessions are a clue, you probably have lots of questions to ask our panelists. So we've got microphones out here. Sir, in the front row center.
Hi, my name's Dick Kaufman. I'm a former CIA officer, U.S. Marine, and I've been in the private sector. You all are very smart, but I haven't heard one word about the ground forces who do 80% of the fighting, 80% of the dying, and get 1% of the budget. 1%. Our guys out there are still using the same family of infantry weapons that I used in Vietnam. And I'm hearing about ICBMs and F-35s, and we ought to put some more attention, I think, and energy and resources into the people that are doing the fighting. Thank you.
Responses?
I don't think you'll find anybody here who disagrees with you. I think your point is well taken, and I think that it's exactly right. And it's not one of the best ways you want to increase morale of our troops is give them newer stuff, give them better stuff, make sure they're protected, make sure they're well cared for. I certainly don't disagree with you at all, and I think your point is incredibly well taken.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is we've actually been investing a lot in the Army and a lot in the Marine Corps, but for a particular type of war, the wars we've been fighting, right? And if you would just take I've done this a couple of times in a couple contexts. Take a picture of a soldier in 2001 and compare that with a soldier in 2016, and you'll actually see a lot of change. And I know the Army likes to, and the Marine Corps even more so, and I say this as a very proud son of a former Marine, likes to say it's not about technology, but technology does matter in ground combat. And we've invested in certain areas of technology. The body armor that soldiers and Marines, actually airmen and sailors too, wear today is much better than it was 15 years ago. The tactical situational awareness, the command and control, all that is much better than it was 15 years ago. But other areas that could be crucial or decisive in a high intensity conflict against a capable adversary, things like electronic warfare, things like active protection system for armored vehicles. Because we've been investing in particular areas of technology, those other areas have been deferred, right? We retrained whole artillery units away from artillery because of the exigencies of Iraq and Afghanistan. Now we're entering a period where artillery and artillery threats are more important. So I don't know that it's necessarily a lack of investment. We've invested for a particular set of wars that we've been fighting. And I think the challenge, particularly for the Army and the Marine Corps, is their requirements in the future are likely to look much different.
Sorry. I will say this though: if you look at percentages of budgets, percentage of where we're spending it among the services, the Army does have less, just in terms of percentage of what things cost. Now, that's not necessarily indicative that they're not getting everything that they need, but again, the point is well taken. The Army tends not to. But I will say that some of the things that I mentioned specifically, especially on space, our dependency on space. Who's dependent on space? The Army's dependent on space. You want to take care of our guys who are deployed, they need to be able to see. And they need to be able to see where the enemy's moving and what they're doing. And that's why I talked about and tried to emphasize a little bit on surveillance as well. So, but then you need to make sure the Army has great access to those new technologies that might end up in the budgets of the Air Force, for instance.
The guys on the ground they need the situational awareness that the space programs can provide.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right.
They're not surprised by an ambush by 17 raggedy-ass Taliban.
That's right.
And so there's going to be structural differences. I think there's structural changes. I think that we're going to have to figure out over the next couple of years as we advance in these technologies in order to make sure that the people who need them the most actually have access to them.
Yeah. So I think two very short points here. One is a lot of our conversation here has been sort of self-deterministic about if the United States does these things, then we'll win. But we're also engaged in a multi-party conflict here where other people get a vote. And we've seen that the advance of commercial technology has really enabled non-state actors in the ground domain. So it's not that hard for our adversaries to have encrypted comms, their own satellite imaging, all this sort of stuff. That's just available now. So they have moved ahead relative to us more than we've seen in some of the other domains. The other thing that I would say, less so for the Marine Corps, but, and we'll hear from General McMaster later today, who I think will disagree a little bit with what I'm about to say. Good. The Army is its own worst enemy right now. The Army does not have a clear vision for what it needs to do in the future, and has not started its own vehicle modernization program. So it's not that there's not money for it, it's that they don't know what they're there to do. And that's fundamentally problematic. I think that the Army today is where the Marine Corps was in 2010. Now, the Marine Corps has done great work over the last, definitely between 2010 and 2014, figuring out here's what the Marine Corps needs to do, crisis response force in readiness for the nation. The Army, it's less clear. There's the frustrating bit there is there's lots that the Army needs to do. A lot of the stuff we're seeing in Eastern Europe is classic Army stuff. And I think they're starting to get to a place where they can articulate that vision. And from there, hopefully, will come good capability modernization efforts.
Rob, did you want to weigh in on this?
Just quickly,
Yeah.
first of all, thank you for your service, and thank you for recognizing the women and men who are out there defending our country in the Army and the Marine Corps on the ground. I would just add that, yes, we talked a lot about airplanes, but the technologies I mentioned earlier have application across airplanes, surface units, subsurface, Army, the data analytics, the open system architectures, the communications. We've done a number of activities, demonstrations where it's all about communicating, to your point, what we're seeing in space, what we're seeing in air, and putting that information in the hands of the men and women on the ground. And that's key. And we're going to continue to do that and advance those types of technologies. So I think we are addressing this. I do agree. The other thing I would say is many of the things we're doing are related to the special forces. Not everything we can talk about in this particular forum, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes, if you will.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to move on to our next question. Gentleman in the back on the far right. Towards back. Oh, hold on, you got a mic coming?
Nicholas Romero, my question is about protection against compromise of technologies, something that's probably not seen so much, but is incredibly important to prevent bandwagoning from near peers. And I'm wondering if you believe that we're spending enough on that to prevent reverse engineering, compromise. We're seeing a lot of news about infiltrators. There was news yesterday about a German intelligence officer who was exposed in the domestic intelligence agency over there. And we've had very recent revelations of information breaches at the National Security Agency. So I'm wondering if you see that the prevention of compromise and reverse engineering as a focus area or something that we should spend more time on.
And I'm actually going to go to Rob first, just from an industry perspective. I mean, that's, I'll give you the first crack at it, and if anybody else wants to weigh in briefly, happy to entertain that as well.
Great, I'll be quick. Cybersecurity is a top priority, and security across the board for that matter, but cyber is one of the big issues we are paying a lot of attention to. And it's a continuous challenge, because the enemy gets better, we got to get better. They get better, we got to get better. And we are continuing to try to keep that advantage versus what our adversaries are doing to basically steal our technology. So it's at the forefront of what we're doing every day. I would also say that there's an element of taking the fight to the enemy, if you will, that offensive cyber. So you don't want to just be playing defense all the time. And there are things that are happening that will keep them playing some defense. And I'll leave it at that. But great question, and at the top of the list for things that we're paying attention to.
Do you want to, anybody else want to?
So I think very briefly, I agree with everything that Rob said. Also, we need to assume that these things are going to keep happening, or that even if they're not happening from espionage, that people are going to figure out the technology that we're using or can develop something similar. We can't let the features of our capability be the key differentiator for our military advantage. And that's why we need to have more diversity and also be able to pair those technologies with new and innovative concepts of operation, so that even if the adversary can reverse engineer our technology, we can still kill them 27 different ways.
Okay. Next question, gentleman with the glasses. Right there.
We've heard today quite a bit about acquisitions and engineering, but one of the other things that the DoD does is research. So I want to ask what you feel is the role of research in the mixture of funding, and especially with regards to the new administration. And I'm speaking specifically about basic research that aims to yield capabilities 10 to 20 years down the line. Thank you.
Anybody want? Actually, Rob, you want to?
Well,
Although basic research by definition
yes.
occurs in academia and outside of industry, but
I think it's balance, and there does need obviously to be funding in the basic research, which is going on. Some of it in the Skunk Works and the advanced development programs at Lockheed, we do some of that work. We tend to be in more of the 6.2, 6.3 arena versus earlier technologies. There are other parts of our corporation are doing it, as well as the rest of industry. But what we're trying to figure out is, when limited resources, is where's the balance. So when you invest in these early technologies, you want to see them mature. And then as the mature technologies are available, you want to transition those into the program of record. The way I have our organization set up, we have a technology arm, we have a program of record arm, and I'm always looking for challenging the technology arm on how we're going to advance it to the programs of record. So, great point, and I think, again, it comes to finding that right balance of resources, but we definitely need to continue to invest in basic research.
The only thing that I would add too is for the last several years, we have a lot of technologies that have been sort of in limbo in research and development that really, again, are ready to move beyond. So although I'm a huge proponent of investing in research for the next generation, because you have to continually look ahead, we've got plenty of really good stuff. We talked about lasers, directed technology, but we always talk about how it's 5 years away. Well, get some people who are serious about it from a matter of policy, and get some money behind it and see what happens to these programs that are really have been continually 5 years away. And I think that we'll start seeing them up close. Remember the airborne laser program, right before it was cut up into many pieces and sent away, it shot down a missile. Now the CONOPS, some people had some problems. It was a directed energy on a 747, so we had some questions about the concept of operations, but we proved that the technology was actually able to do what we wanted it to do. Now we're trying to look at that directed energy and see how we can perhaps get it on a more usable platform. But that's just one example that we really are ready to go with some of these technologies that we've been sitting on for a while.
I would just say that the United States basic research capability, especially through the DoD lab network, is one of our key differentiators. And I worry that over the next 4 to 8 years, that funding is going to get cut to that in a search for like stuff that we can have immediately, and we'll be eating our own seed corn. And I think that will be really dangerous for the future. I agree at the same time that we do need to have better methods by which we can harvest the great work that's done and then move those things forward. But that shouldn't be at the expense of that fundamental research, because other people can't do it in the way that we can.
Right. Well, I think the sign of any good panel is we leave questions on the table, and I know I see a number of hands up, but in the interest of keeping us on schedule, that will have to be the last question. I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for the discussion.